de Feuvre. She's going to talk about the artist and the ideas around. And she's going to talk for about an hour, and after that she'll be very happy to answer questions that any of you may have. So here's Lisa.
Okay, thank you, Cliff. So what I'm going to do is, Cliff said, I'm going to talk for about an hour or so, and I'm going to show a selection of slides, some of which look at work that's in the exhibition, and some of which are work that aren't necessarily in the show, and we may want to come back to talk a bit about them later. I've also got a few documentary shots of the exhibition when it opened at the CCA in Glasgow as well, to give a sense of how it looked, and it looked quite different in that venue. Perfect. Okay, so the selection of work by Gordon Matta-Clark in the exhibition here is not seeking to be a retrospective or a complete survey of his work. What it is I wanted to try and investigate this idea of the space between. I think if we try and think about how to find a starting point for talking about Matta-Clark's work, it's very, very difficult because there's so many. You could describe his work as coming from performance, from architecture, from photography, from political engagement with the city. You could also put it in relation to ideas around language as well. There's endless different entry points. And what particularly fascinates me about his work is the way that he slips between all these different definitions. And that's very much what I wanted to look at in the selection for the work in this show. Also, what I wanted to do is I wanted to try and address Matta-Clark's journey beneath, through, and above architecture, and also try and ask the question with his work, what is the work? Because I think it's this incredibly slippery thing, and it is very, very difficult to tie it down in some way. I think we also need to ask that question because we're looking at his work some 30 years after it was made. So when we're looking at his work, we're also looking at it through history, so through anecdotes, through documentation. I think that it's really, really essential to take this point into account. And I think that the historical component of the 30 years since the work was made adds a critical urgency and agency to the work. And it highlights the discourses throughout Matta-Clark's practice as a whole, rather than focusing on discrete works. I also think that contemporary artistic production recontextualizes and also mediates readings of Matta-Clark's work. I think that if we look at lots of contemporary practice or work maybe made over the last, 10 to 15 years or so, we can see concerns echoing Matta-Clark's. So the kind of most obvious connection is to make a connection between his work and Rachel Whiteread's work. Also, we could look at Gregor Schneider's rearticulation of domestic space. Also, I think Liam Gillick's methodology of working in what he calls the middle ground. An artist like Grit Taravina, and he looks at particular social spaces, so trying to encourage discourse around artwork, but also between different people. And Taravina is particularly interested in doing this through cooking, which is another concern that Matta-Clark was particularly interested in, through his restaurant film, through his restaurant food. Walter Benjamin wrote, one of his most famous quotes is that he was very interested in telescoping the past through the present. So looking to the past while firmly recognizing the influence of the present day. And I think this methodology we have to look at when we consider Matta-Clark's work. It's also, I think, even all the more pertinent because Matta-Clark was very interested in himself in looking at Benjamin's writings. I think for me as well it becomes even more important to do because if we think about this question, what is the work? I'm in a position where either I'm of the wrong generation and from the wrong continent to have ever seen any of his building cuts in situ. So the way that I know Matta-Clark's work is through documentation, through books, and through the work that we've got on display here. And so we also need to think about the mythology and the anecdotes around the past moment of when the work started the process of their existence. I think that when we look at Matta-Clark's work, we need to think about it as a process that's constantly developing. So what I want to do is I want to talk about a few specific works that are represented in this show, and also try and think through architecture a little bit, as the subtitle of the show suggests. And hopefully that's something that we'll be able to look at a bit more in the discussion, because I think most of us here are studying, or most of you here are studying at the AA, and you'll know far more about architecture than I will. I think that this issue of layering of time, we also need to consider it in relation to constantly shifting political and social contexts. So one specific example I want to talk a little bit about is the French artist Pierre Huyghe. He made a work called Light Conical Intersect in 1996. And this was a complete reworking of Matta-Clark's work, Conical Intersect, which you can see on the right-hand side here. And this is a shot from the show when it was exhibited at the CCA. What Pierre Huyghe did is he took a single frame of the film that accompanies this work, Conical Intersect, and he projected it onto the original site of where the work was made, which is in a pair of buildings sited next to the Pompidou Centre. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. I think what Pierre Huyghe does by looking at this artwork is he's looking at Matta-Clark's work as a historical event. And what he's doing is he's making a cut through time in the same way that Matta-Clark made a cut through space as well. So it's doubling back the practice of Matta-Clark's work. Another kind of, this is another image from Conical Intersect. Another point that I think makes this, this kind of importance of looking at the changing political and social shifts is Matta-Clark's interest and almost obsession with the World Trade Towers. He was really, really interested in them. He was particularly interested in the way that they suddenly appeared on the skyline in 1973. And in 1974, as a member of the Anna Architecture Group, he photographed not the Twin Towers, but the space between them. That was what interested him, the way that when you looked at the Twin Towers, they framed the horizon in some way. And he wanted to look at this negative space that was created between them. So, designed by Minoru Yamashiki, the towers were one of the few new constructions in New York during the city's move towards bankruptcy in the 1970s. The World Trade Center rose above Soho simply because it had been planned a few years earlier by the New York Port Authority, and it was actively supported by the Rockefellers. So rather than the 1970s situation of architecture towering above a city in economic crisis, this location now really is a negative space, interrupting the heart of commerce. I think to look at Matta-Clark's photographs of the Twin Towers following September the 11th, it's impossible to automatically connect that work without thinking about the situations that happened in 2001. So the support of the Rockefellers helped the realization of the World Trade Towers, and they promoted a re-articulation of the city through this construction. The Rockefellers were also really, really strong patrons of the arts and were big supporters of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. In 1978, Matta-Clark was invited by MoMA to make a proposal for one of their buildings on West 53rd Street, which had been designed by Philip Johnson. What the plan was, and this is one of the proposals that he made for it, the plan was to demolish this wing, or MoMA planned to demolish this wing as part of an expansion to their museum. It was an idea that was never executed. And in the interim period, the building was planned to become an artwork, and Matta-Clark would be commissioned to make this artwork. Matta-Clark based his proposal on notions of patronage, with reference to the Rockefellers, and what he decided to do is to look to an older family of patrons, the Medicis of Florence, as his inspiration. As well as being patrons of art, the Medicis wielded incredibly strong power over the city, based on their economic wealth. So what Matta-Clark did is he based his design that we've seen in the last couple of slides on the Medici's coat of arms. And what the coat of arms is, it's a number of balls in a kind of sort of tripartite arrangement. Matta-Clark intended to make a series of spherical cuts into the buildings. So these were negative versions of the circles on the crest that were to be cut into the glass and steel facade. And I think that when we look at the drawings, they indicate that the cuts were going to be made in a three-dimensional manner. And so what he wanted to do was he wanted to show depth into the facade of the building and indicate volume through the skin of the building, both through what was removed and through what remained. And this kind of discourse or shift between removal and something remaining, I think that runs through most of Matta-Clark's practice. I think it's very interesting that in this work that was to be sanctified by a major arts world institution, Matta-Clark looked to turn things inside out, which is a strategy running through his entire practice. I think that in the light of subsequent constant, mainly through the 1980s, interest of artists in institutional critiques, I think that we could easily place that within those discourses to add kind of yet another way of entry into Matta-Clark's work. So while this exhibition, Gordon Matta-Clark, The Space Between, reads Matta-Clark's work through the present, it's also essential not to forget the relevance of its own making. His work was created at a point when ideas around the dematerialization of the art object were central to artistic practice. And I think we need to look a little bit at the context of his cultural production. Artists a generation older than Matta-Clark, such as Christo, Robert Smithson, and Robert Rauschenberg, and Matta-Clark's peers, such as Richard Nonus, Joan Smith, Joseph Kossuth, will have influenced Matta-Clark's practice. I also think in a great many ways the period between, I guess, 1969 and 1974 in New York, when Matta-Clark was really developing the early stage of his career, is quite often looked back today as almost a golden age of artistic production. And this, of course, lays a massive trap for being very, very nostalgic about Matta-Clark's work. I think we also kind of need to kind of look at all the myths around Matta-Clark. All the descriptions describe him as an incredible erudite, sociable man, someone who was constantly talking. And of course his premature death adds to this kind of myth around the artist. And it's something that in this exhibition I try very hard not to think about, because I think it gets in the way of the artwork, but I don't think you can completely ignore it. I also think if we look back to New York between 69 and 74, there's a lot of examples of what was happening in the city then that we can see happening in London at the moment. It was an area of gentrification of inner city areas. It was a time as well when artists moved into rundown areas. Then they gradually developed a kind of increase in the desirability of that area. Rents went up, artists moved out. So it's something that we can see in countless places within London. So in places like Shoreditch and Deptford as well, I think. So how do we look and how do we know Matta-Clark's work now? I think to look at even the photographs produced by Matta-Clark to document his works, so that's opposed to the photo works where he's manipulating the actual image, it's very difficult to read the images. I think sometimes you can't grasp immediately what they're referring to. And even in doing things like preparing a lecture for this, it's very hard to work out whether my slides are the right way up or not, because it's just impossible to work out where he's coming from with them. I think that his photography he used as an active device to try and displace the space between representation and object. And I think that it's in this gap that he used for communication throughout his production. He used both photography and film to both document performance events, but he also manipulated the representative quality of photography to question the status and language of the image. I think this work here, which is called Pipes, which was made in 1971, which consists of mounted photographs and gas pipes, is an example of work that's particularly confusing when you look at it. I think at first glance it's not apparent that this is documentation, so in terms of this slide I'm showing here, of a work that consists of photographs representing the space behind the gallery walls. So this is a work that it explicitly combines the key elements of Matta-Clark's practice, both cutting and photography. So what he did there is he photographed, or he went to the walls of the exhibition space where the piece was to be installed and cut open the walls. And he wanted to reveal the space behind the walls. And as is usual in lots of buildings, in this cavity, a line of gas pipes ran to service the building, and these Matta-Clark photographed. So then, as photographs, the pipes were returned to the wall, but this time as a representation of the surface of the wall, behind which the pipes invisibly laid. So it becomes this constant duplicating and multiplying, looking at representation and moving beyond representation. Whoops, same one. The writer Lisa Baer notes of the later work Splitting, which I guess is probably Matta-Clark's most famous work. She notes that a cut is a very simple thing if you see it in graphic terms only. What struck me about the Humphrey Street building was how much it seemed to reveal. So if we think about Matta-Clark drawing through architecture, so wielding a chainsaw instead of wielding a pencil, what he's doing is he's revealing the building. And what I particularly like about kind of this image here is the way that when you look at it like this, you can't even tell there's a building behind the facade. There's this slight confusion that's going on. I think that in the work Pipes that we looked at before, and also in Splitting, what Matta-Clark is doing is he's revealing the invisible layers that produces architecture. So that's layers in terms of materials and layers in terms of histories. Indeed, Matta-Clark spoke of how these layers revealed the autobiographical process of the building's making. I think it's also interesting here to reference some Matta-Clark's drawings. And if anyone came to Jane Crawford's lecture on Tuesday, earlier this week, she had a few really nice slides of some of his drawings. So he created several series of drawings that were layers of paper. So layers of paper which were framed. And then what Matta-Clark did was he cut into the paper. He then decided to frame these images behind glass. But they were then framed, but he left one side of the picture frame open. And they were to be displayed on the floor. So what you'd see is you see something that was almost creating a hole in the floor of the exhibition space, as well as seeing something that created a series of cuts. So the drawings that we looked at before of the MoMA proposals, I think they're inextricably related to their site. So when we look at the proposals, we can see that the method of cutting, or the potential methods of cutting and drawing on blueprint representations of architecture, shows that he was dealing with buildings itself. I think also this work here, which is my favourite work that we've got in the exhibition, except it's twice as large as this one. This is from a work called A Whole House. And the full title of the word is A Whole House, Rooftop Atrium and Datum Cut. Now this was an artwork that had a whole bundle of different elements to it. What Matta-Clark did here is he made a triangular cut in the corner walls of an abandoned storehouse in Milan. So Matta-Clark wanted to make cuts into a building that looked like drawing. And due to the nature of the construction materials, these cuts were created through a process of chiseling and scoring, in the exact same way that Matta-Clark made his cut drawings, where he was scoring and chiseling through stacks of paper and card. I think this method of representation, of using the same action as what is being represented, so making drawings, and the action of making the drawings then leads on to making the work, really sets up a dialogue between the different modes of his working practice. So Matta-Clark's practice was a process that used events and objects beyond what we could see as being their established use values. Matta-Clark stated, so this is a quote from him, "Everyone's ownership is determined by the use factor." And here he was looking to Marx's definition of the development of value and exchange, whereby value converts all products into some kind of symbol of social structure. Matta-Clark himself described his strategy as being one that was based on Marxist hermeneutics. And he said that the meaning of this term, so this is Matta-Clark's definition, he says that it helps me think about my activities that combine the inwardly removed sphere of hermeneutics and interpretation with the material dialectics of a real environment. The activity takes the form of a theatrical gesture that cleaves structural space. Here I am directing my attention to the central void, to the gap which, amongst other things, could be seen between the self and the American capitalist system. So that's kind of one of those classic quotes from an artist that kind of makes sense, but kind of doesn't really make sense. But what I think it indicates is that Matta-Clark was a very socially and politically engaged artist. And I think that that's something that hasn't been recognised enough in his practice, necessarily. So inspired, as I mentioned before, by the works of Walter Benjamin, Matta-Clark in that quote is describing himself as interpreting the world and systems around him in terms of relationships between economics, society, and the individual. Between 1972 and 1973, Matta-Clark made a series of works in the Bronx that directly engaged with how the city responded to economic factors. And I don't have any slides of this work, but there's some work in the show. Bronx Floors was the umbrella title for a number of different cuts. Clandestinely, sections were removed from the floors and walls of in a number of locations in the ghetto areas of the Lower East Side and the Bronx. And he visited buildings that he described as being occupied primarily by packs of dogs and periodically by junkies. So he was kind of painting this very bleak picture of this area of New York. So to return from kind of moving vertically up and through architecture in works, oh sorry, that's upside down, in works such as Bronx Floors and Splitting, I think that it's also important to note that Matta-Clark was very interested in the space underneath the city. And a lot of the work that we've got upstairs in the front members' room looks at this part of his practice. Matta-Clark stated that his interest in working underneath the city was a fairly political attempt to try and work, and this is a quote from him again, work back into society from beneath, to bring the art out of the gallery into the sewers. So with quoting Matta-Clark, Matta-Clark describes himself as using language with a dyslexic humour. He was really interested in twisting words round and making nonsense. And upstairs again in the front members' room, we've got a few Xeroxes of some of his notebooks. And one of my favourite ones is when he talks about no wattage. So he's kind of making up words that are his own. They don't necessarily have a definition, but they come to mean something through their use in some way. I want to talk in a little bit of detail about a work that's one of the films that's shown upstairs in the members' room, which is an artwork called Substrate. Now, Substrate is a work that came out of another work called Underground Dailies. Underground Dailies was an exhibition that was shown at Holly Solomon's 98 Green Street Gallery in 1976, which took Matta-Clark beneath the city, as he had previously with works such as Time Well and Winter Garden, which was the last slide I showed with the bottle shoved into a basement. What he did was he filmed beneath New York through subways, sewers and water tunnels each day for the duration of the exhibition. And then what he'd do is he'd show the results of the previous day's filming in the gallery space. He was interested in the myths of underground New York, venturing to locations such as the tracks and arches under Grand Central Station, the foundations under the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and the subway under Fortune Street. So following the exhibition, the series of films were edited together to form Substrate, which is a 6-part film where there's colour footage above ground and black and white footage below ground. And there's a number of different sections to it. And And I think the one that I find most interesting is when Matta-Clark travels below Grand Central Station. And there's a soundtrack to it that consists of a conversation, or a telephone conversation, between Gordon Matta-Clark and the administrator of Grand Central Station. And the voiceover denies Matta-Clark permission to film underneath Grand Central Station. And Matta-Clark's asking the administrator various questions about the tracks under Grand Central Station. And he says, does anyone live there? And he also says, I heard that there's a secret door that businessmen use as a shortcut to their offices in their lunch hour. And the administrator was saying, no, this is all rubbish. This isn't true at all. But then while you're watching the film, you see the businessmen going through the secret door. You see people living underneath Grand Central Station. And kind of with a lot of Matta-Clark's films, it's not fantastic quality, but it's really worth straining to hear the text and the sound in it, because it's quite funny, and also it contextualizes Matta-Clark's work quite a lot. The final underground visit in this film is a visit to the Arch Street extension of the Brooklyn-Manhattan Tunnel, where Matta-Clark's guide explains, and this is a quote from him, underneath that verticalism lies a horizontal body of tunnels, much the same as a man lying on his back with his veins and arteries. So the guide is talking about the verticalism of the city, so in terms of the skyscrapers, and then looking at the way that it's serviced by all this stuff underneath the city. And this seems to be a notion that really inspired Matta-Clark, and he returns again to this idea in other works, such as Office Baroque. Later, in another film called Sous-Sol de Paris, Matta-Clark explored subterranean Paris in a film that moves through underground car parks, basements, cellars, architectural ruins, and also the labyrinthine catacombs around the Opera District. So Matta-Clark also then, from this work, created these collages that we've got upstairs of his work in underground Paris. And what you see is, you see at the top a tourist destination, so Notre Dame and Saint-Michel. And then the photographs underneath are images of what he found underneath the city. So I think this is kind of quite an interesting exploration of this idea of trying to find out these arteries underneath the city. In the same year as making this work, so 1977, Matta-Clark made a work called Descending Steps for Bataan, that's been used in the exhibition poster for the show. And I wanted to talk a little bit about this work. It's not a work that we could possibly necessarily represent in the exhibition. This work was dedicated to Matta-Clark's brother, Sebastian, or Bataan, who had died the previous summer. And it took the form of a performance at the Yvon Lambert Gallery in Paris. Each day of the exhibition, during gallery opening times, Matta-Clark dug down into the floor of the gallery, forming steps as he descended. So that's what this photo work, you can kind of see the gallery space at the top, and there the hole has got pretty deep. And in the one on the far right-hand side, you can just about see Matta-Clark down the hole. I think this work relates quite strongly to a series of work Matta-Clark made in the basement of 112 Green Street during 1971 that are explained in the Xeroxes upstairs. Now, this was a durational work where time was really, really important. And I think the time element of it was as important as the excavation. And of course, it also relates to the work Underground Dailies as well, that was process-based and kind of looking at the day-to-day exhibition. I think it's also interesting to note that unlike a number of other works, so such as Splitting, Conical Intersect, Matta-Clark chose not to make a film representation of this work. And he only made one representation of the work, and that's this image here, which is a single collage of photographs taped together with photography tape. I think each of these images shows a different point in the process, starting with that view of the gallery, then moving down to Matta-Clark working progressively lower beneath the floor. So Paris was also the location for the work Conical Intersect that I showed a few slides from earlier. And the original plan for this work, Conical Intersect, was to make a work in the Beaubourg area that would cut a hole actually through the potential George Pompidou Centre that was in the process of being made. So it was a building in progress. When it came down to it, this wasn't possible. And what he did instead is he made a work in as I mentioned before, in the last two remaining buildings next door to the hole. This is a work where Matta-Clark used photographs as in documentation, photo works, and also a film. And the film of the exhibition shows the Bonneville buildings. So the two buildings that he cut through had been designed for Mr. and Mrs. Bonneville. So they had one building each. And the film shows the Bonneville buildings from the street, focusing into an expanding hole being made by Matta-Clark. And at various points you kind of see a hand with a hammer on it appearing through the hole. The camera moves up to look at the hole from the inside of the building to the street below. It then focuses on the facade of a building that, like walls, which is one of the first slides that I showed, was once the interior wall of a building. So this work, Conical Intersect, really was a performance because it was so public. And Matta-Clark, in an interview in the journal Avalanche, recalls his favourite comment from an onlooker. And it's a quote from Matta-Clark. A 70-year-old Paris concierge said, "Oh, I see the purpose for that hole. It's an experiment in bringing light and air into spaces that never had enough of either." So I think Matta-Clark's recording of the concierge's comment is by no means incidental. Oh, sorry, that's upside down. Move on to the next one. It's by no means incidental. I think bringing light and air into a space is one of the classic strategies of modernist architecture. And I think that he was very much looking at the replanning going on in the area of the former market, Les Halles. And it was a point where there was lots of buildings going on in Paris, meant to be symbols of economic success and moving forward into the future. And rather than celebrating this symbolic architectural language, Conical Intersect recycles an existing building using the same grammatical structure. Matta-Clark also described Conical Intersect as a sort of street theatre. And I think that's quite an interesting quote because it really shows that Matta-Clark was interested in the theatricality of his work. Matta-Clark stated once that he was interested in thinking in 3 dimensions at once. And he described himself as working with non-architecture. So what he was doing was he was using a methodology that addressed and addresses architectural implications, but does not become architecture. He looked at his surrounding environment, whether it was New York or Paris, to try and look at the ever-present inner city abandoned buildings. And he wanted to use buildings that had been left behind, using them as throwaways in the same way that other artists might use ready-mades. Matta-Clark states, "The determining factor is the degree to which my intervention can transform the structure into an act of communication." So this idea of communication, Matta-Clark really wanted his artwork to communicate, to be something that would encourage discussion, to move the artwork into some kind of discursive space in some way. So there's a specific work that I also want to talk a little bit about that isn't in the... Oh, that's really bad slide. I'll just move on to this piece here. That isn't in the exhibition. And I kind of in a way wish that it could have been in the exhibition because it would be very pertinent to the architecture school. It wasn't possible to show it here because the AA doesn't have quite good enough environmental conditions. So Matta-Clark was interested in the breaking of building surfaces. And he was also interested in windows as well. The very first few slides that I showed were proposals for making cuts in New York University. Windows reoccur in this work here, called Window Blowout, which was made when Matta-Clark was invited to exhibit in the 1976 Idea as Model show at the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies in New York. His initial proposal was to work with an unused and very unpopular seminar room, and it was a temporary structure. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to cut it into 2 by 2 foot square pieces and stack them in the middle of a room. So a proposal that relates to works like Bronx floors and also walls paper that I'll show you a few slides of later. However, quite a kind of different work was realised. He infamously went along to the School of Architecture and saw some beautiful models that the architectural students had made, and they made him very, very cross. He felt that they were very much looking forward to a kind of utopia through architecture, and he then changed what he wanted to do. So later that evening, as Jane Crawford talked about in her lecture this week, Matta-Clark and Jane Crawford went to a private view at the Holly Solomon Gallery, and then after the private view went back to the Institute of Architecture to supposedly make the artwork. And with all the kind of anecdotes around Matta-Clark, lots of people say that he was incredibly drunk at the time, but I'm sure that's all kind of mythologizing it. What he did is he arrived early in the morning, so kind of 1 or 2 o'clock, and he borrowed an air rifle off the artist Dennis Oppenheim and shot the windows out of the exhibition hall with this rifle. What he then did is he lined each of the window casements with photographs that he'd taken in the Bronx. So photographs where the windows had been smashed by the local residents. So what Matta-Clark was doing here is he was bringing the Bronx to Manhattan. And so he was really interested in looking at the way that within cities there's different rhythms of development. So the urban renewal that took place in New York under the auspices of urban planner Robert Moses led to a number of slum clearances where a lot of primarily African American and Puerto Rican New Yorkers were forced to move from Manhattan in this slum clearance development into areas such as the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens. Matta-Clark described the Bronx as the epitome of urban neglect, which was in complete opposition of the idea of a school and profession celebrating the success of the evolving city. And of the area in the Bronx, the critic Rosalind Joyce points out, Matta-Clark seemed to acknowledge, and in any case underscored, the fact that by the 1970s the Bronx had become a symbol of the waste that architecture tries to repress, and of the differences that the city tries to exclude as it homogenizes space. A symbol, in other words, of the segregated nature of New York. I think also when we kind of look at works like this, it's interesting to look at Rem Koolhaas's book, Delirious New York, which was originally published in 1978. And in this book, he describes New York in the 20th century as being driven by a utopian desire for progress, where the historical core of the city would be replaced with the new modernism of the skyscraper. So the Bronx was an area of New York that was undergoing a process of gentrification. And in the work Window Blowout, for a moment, through photographs such as this, the South Bronx had moved into Manhattan. In spite of being one of his most infamous and best-known works, like Splitting, hardly anyone actually saw this work. The window panes were replaced before the exhibition opened the next day, so literally in the space of about 2 hours. And because the chair of the school felt that this was an insulting act to his school. So it's something that doesn't even exist in documentation at all whatsoever. And I think that this is a work that combines lots of Matta-Clark's ideas. And again, if we think about this question, what is the work? It's a work that exists. This is the artwork that circulates. But what this is this isn't a photograph of the School of Architecture or the Institute of Architecture. It's a photograph of the images of the Bronx that were inserted into the School of Architecture. So So it's a work that exists through myth, effectively. So in works such as window blowouts, and also works like splitting, and works like Office Baroque, which this is a slide from, Matta-Clark was creating new openings into buildings. In the film of the 1974 work Splitting, which again we've got upstairs in the front members' room, a text describes the abandoned house was filled by a sliver of sunlight that passed the day throughout the rooms. So once again, light and air were being brought into a building. Splitting was the first official cut that Matta-Clark had made. So he was moving away from the clandestine methods that he'd used in earlier works, like Bronx Floors. It was located in suburban New Jersey, at number 322 Humphrey Street, an area that, like the Bronx, was undergoing urban renewal, or another way of saying that, gentrification as well. All of the other earlier cutting works have been unauthorized, but this time his dealer and patrons, Holly and Horace Solomon, supported the work. And in doing some research for this exhibition, I interviewed Holly Solomon, and she came up with all these kind of amazing remembrances that I don't think were wholly accurate from Matta-Clark. But she recalls, and this is a quote from her, "Gordon called me up once and said, 'I would like to cut a house in half.' And I said, 'Gordon, what am I supposed to do about that?' So, like a nice Jewish housewife, I called my husband, and I said, 'Horace, Gordon needs a house. He has to cut it in half.' He said, 'What the hell am I supposed to do about that?' And 1 week later, he said, 'You know, I think I have a house for Gordon.'" So Holly and Horace Solomon really supported Matta-Clark throughout the kind of early stage of his career. On acquiring the property, so it was a property that the Solomons had bought as an investment, it was full of objects left behind by the last tenants. So these personal objects were removed by Matta-Clark. And I think kind of, I get the sense, kind of looking at his work, that was almost a mark of respect to move these personal items outside of the house. But of course that's complete projection. I've got no idea if that's the case. Once these personal objects were removed, the work began by cutting a 1-inch slice through all the structural surfaces, dividing the building in half. The second stage was to bevel down the 40 lineal feet of the foundation so the rear half could be lowered by 1 foot. And this is a quote from the film that's upstairs. "The central split was formed by a 5-degree tilt, activating the house with a brilliant wedge of sunlight that spilled into every room. So the split widened as it went up vertically to a distance of about 2 feet or so. Later, the 4 corners of the house were cut from the second floor and were slid out using air conditioner lifts. And the objects cut out of the buildings were then exhibited at the John Gibson Gallery." So when Holly Solomon commissioned this work, she had to hire a bus to take people out to New Jersey. Matta-Clark was really interested in the inaccessibility of the work. It required a special trip to be made outside of the city to suburban areas that people didn't naturally want to go to. And also the kind of interaction with the work entailed a certain amount of risk, as visitors had to jump across the cuts in order to move through the building. Now, if you think about inaccessibility in relation to architecture, it's the complete opposite. By definition, surely architecture must be accessed in some way. So this work, Splitting, and also other works like this one as well, Matta-Clark, he wanted to try and explore the ambiguity of structure. He wanted to really look at the spaces, sorry, that's upside down, the spaces that he could make within the architecture. So you can see that he's cutting through the buildings, revealing this autobiography of the buildings, and also showing that structure isn't necessarily anything to do with the skins of the buildings themselves. So the works Splitting and also Bingo, they look to work against the object-like treatment of the suburban home, looking to work against the notion of the stability of buildings. And I think also we could relate Matta-Clark's work as trying to look beyond the object status of art as well, trying to move into something else. Matta-Clark stated, the notion of mutable space is especially taboo in one's own home. People live in their spaces with a temerity that is frightening. So Matta-Clark wanted to try and almost cut against that kind of stability of kind of one's home, trying to show that buildings weren't as simple as they necessarily seemed to be. In the work that I mentioned before, A Whole House, which was made in 1973, I want to talk just briefly a little bit more about that work. In this work, which took place in Genoa, Matta-Clark was invited or was offered the office in the drafting room of an iron foundry building that had been scheduled for demolition. Matta-Clark described it as a little terracotta building, very Mediterranean, with a shingle roof, with a beautiful structure. Now, in this work, he was fascinated by the interior plan, which had developed from a simple and rigorous dividing process around the centre of the building. So a square room had been divided in half, one half of which became the drafting room. The second half was again divided in half, one side for an office, and the other again divided in two for a bathroom and a coat room, with the bathroom further divided in two for a shower. So this dividing and subdividing resulted in a very complicated intersection of doors and fixed on the centre of the building. So everything was progressively divided, so the remaining piece was 1/32 of the whole. So what Matta-Clark did to start off with is he removed a square section from the roof, and then the cut was projected down the building, laterally through the walls, to make the work that we can see in the gallery, datum cut in the gallery in there. So what he was doing is that he was doing his kind of familiar play on vertical and horizontal axes of architecture, trying again to defute or denounce the idea that a building was supported by its walls. In 1977, Matta-Clark tied together a number of earlier projects, including the cut buildings, spatial volumes, voids, and horizontal vertical interplays, in his work Office Baroque, which was located in Antwerp in Belgium. And a few slides back I showed a few images of that. In this, a boat-shaped extraction was made in a 5-floor building. And this was the first of his projects built around a spiral that he'd returned to in a later work, Circus or the Caribbean Orange. As well as inverting the building's 3 dimensions, and just before I continue, this is, I don't know if you've seen, but we've got a garbage wall made outside that's based on a prototype that Matta-Clark made. This is the version of garbage wall that we made when the exhibition was in Glasgow. So going back to this work, Office Baroque, what Matta-Clark wanted to do is he wanted to try and again invert the plan of the building, and he wanted to try and locate a building that would turn into its context. So where Office Baroque was located, it was located in a tourist centre. And there's a film that accompanies it, where Matta-Clark keeps on referring to something he calls that dumb piece of sculpture down there, which was a tourist attraction that lots of people wanted to go and see. So what Matta-Clark wanted to do is he wanted people to look at what already existed, to look at the architecture and try and move through it in some way. What he did was he dissected this office building, and he wanted this building to confront the institution of the Stein Castle that was just opposite the building, to try and somehow think a little bit about how one architecture could confront a different architecture and enter it into a dialogue in some way. So just to talk a little bit, because I've got the slides up here, and this is the first time I've seen these slides projected, so it's lovely to see them. So Garbage Wall was made when Matta-Clark was working with the curator, Alana Heiss, and it was made for the Brooklyn Bridge event of 1971. And this was organised as an annual event that was meant to celebrate the construction of this bridge that's kind of been seen in so many movies that it feels completely familiar, even if you've never seen it. And underneath this bridge, the space was taken over by a number of artists and performers. And at this event, Matta-Clark made the prototype piece, Garbage Wall, and he also made the film Firechild, the performance and film Pig Roast, both of which we're showing next week in the film programme, and the sculpture and photographs Jacks. So these were very early works, and I think these were the first explorations into the ways in which individuals use space around them. The film Firechild records the making of a garbage wall. A garbage wall is meant to be constructed out of people's other throwaways and be moulded together in some way with concrete, with tar, with plaster. Here at the AA we use concrete, at the CCA we use plaster. He made this as an architectural prototype. During Matta-Clark's life it was reconstructed, I think, 4 times in total. And then since then, it's been reconstructed. I think this is the 3rd time it's been reconstructed since. So Matta-Clark wanted to think a little bit about how one of his prototype buildings, like Garbage Wall, or even one of his cut buildings, he saw no way that they could not be livable in the same way as the Soho lofts that he renovated. And that's a garbage wall made by Matta-Clark. So how Matta-Clark supported himself financially was he was a builder, and he worked on transforming a number of New York lofts into, or transforming light industrial buildings into habitable New York lofts. So he did most of the construction work, and he worked with Philip Glass, who did the electricity on all of the buildings. So kind of with this kind of construction, Matta-Clark was bringing what he did for his kind of day-to-day life into making his own artwork as well. Matta-Clark also worked with Philip Glass on a project that was never actually realised, and this is another project that Holly Solomon told me about. Holly Solomon opened up a gallery at 98 Green Street, which is in Soho, and this was really the hub of artistic practice in New York during the 1970s. What Holly Solomon asked him to do is she asked him to make a work that would be part of the architecture. So what Matta-Clark intended to do is he intended to work with Philip Glass on the plumbing, so that the plumbing would be constructions on wheels that could be moved around the space at will. So what he wanted to do was, this is a quote from Holly Solomon about this piece of work. Gordon had this schema that everything was going to be on wheels. The dressing rooms would be on wheels. The toilets would be on wheels. This was in 1969. Horace, thank God, had the good sense, and he really wanted to know where the bathroom was at all times, with none of this movable stuff. So probably quite wisely, this wasn't implemented, this plan. But I think it's kind of quite a kind of nice anecdote, because it shows Matta-Clark's enthusiasm to try and do things that seemed impossible. It would be impossible, I'm surely it would be impossible, to have a toilet that would be on wheels and would be moving around a gallery. So Matta-Clark wanted to try and make works that worked with space that people were, or with objects and spaces that people were familiar with. So he did things like look to the graffiti that was everywhere in New York during the 1970s. One final work that I want to talk about involves a kind of architectural realisation. And this was a work called Open House of 1972. And this used a large dumpster, which Matta-Clark used described as a piece of found architecture. So he placed one of these dumpsters, or kind of massive skips, from the U-Haul container service on Green Street between the gallery spaces at 112 and 98. And then within this dumpster, he created a series of walls. And these walls were used, were made using the DIY staples of 2x4 timber, plasterboard, and also doors that he found just lying around the area. So as I mentioned before, Soho was undergoing a change. There was lots and lots of building work going on. And Matta-Clark just salvaged as much material as he could. He then created a film, and he invited some of his dancer friends to dance through this architecture that he had created. And then at one point it starts raining. So Matta-Clark runs out and gets some umbrellas and creates a roof out of umbrellas to hold out the rain. This was an event that was basically centering on making something out of nothing, making something out of waste products. And I think that kind of this almost throwaway piece of work of Matta-Clark, and there's a film that accompanies it, of Matta-Clark with some very kind of hippie-ish looking friends, getting a bit drunk and running around this dumpster. It's a work that is really, really important to his practice. I think the throwaway element is something that runs through everything. It runs through his materials. It runs through in terms of finding leftover buildings. It runs through the way that he's trying to turn attention to what had been ignored. But it also refers to the throwaway element of Matta-Clark's humour. I think that his work is very, very funny and quite silly as well in lots of cases. And I think that we need to kind of take that as part of his practice. And I think that his irreverence to cultural production is as important as looking at the actual artwork itself. So, a couple of final slides. The restaurant food, I've obviously spoken quicker than I thought I would. The restaurant food, we've got the video of it upstairs. This is where Matta-Clark created a social space. So you can see some images here. That's Matta-Clark on the bottom right-hand corner. And Matta-Clark kind of worked in the kitchens with fellow artists to create what he called food theatre. So to create a social space of exchange, where it was a kind of an enterprise that was designed to employ artists and feed artists as well, because at that time there were no restaurants in the area of Soho. But it was also an ongoing art object in itself, so a restaurant as an artwork. And I think I'll stop there before carrying on, because I've come up to my hour, and I want to hopefully kind of give you time to ask some questions and have a discussion. So that's it. So has anyone got any questions or any kind of clarification on any of the works that I didn't explicitly talk about?
I'd like to ask about the very last project, MoMA, which has always puzzled me because, if I've understood it rightly, it was not an intervention in an old building, but it was to be incorporated at the inception of the design. Now, it seems to me that for his work to be incorporated at the inception was a departure in his work, or would have been if it had been carried out. And I don't know whether really it's what he wanted, because in a way it puts him on the side of everything that he'd been against previously.
Yeah, so the question was referring to the proposals for MoMA, which were those 6 proposals I showed fairly early on, which were made in 1978. Now that was also the time that Matta-Clark made a work called Circus or the Caribbean Orange, and that one was actually realised. And I think with both of them, the idea was that the artwork wouldn't be something permanent. So almost in the construction process, Matta-Clark would create these kind of amazing spherical cuts running through the building. So the MoMA proposal wasn't actually realised, but if we relate it to the circus piece, what Matta-Clark did is the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago acquired a kind of little building that they wanted to extend their museum into. So Matta-Clark cut into it, but then as they renovated the building, the renovations almost ate up Matta-Clark's piece of artwork, or it disappeared into the architecture. And so what it was something that was going away. It wasn't a permanent fixture. So it was almost looking at a building, turning it into something that was an art object, but through the process of the renovation or excavation in some way. But I think that kind of it is interesting to think that both the MoMA proposals and Circus were very, very late works in Matta-Clark's practice. And so one could kind of, I don't know, project countless kind of ideas for what he would have done afterwards. But I think I kind of agree with you and I kind of don't agree with you. Because the architecture was going to, or the artwork was going to disappear into the architecture, he was really taking on board this more time-based element of creating a kind of rhythm through the building as it changed. I don't know that.
Well, of course we're in the area of speculation because he died.
Yeah.
But it strikes me as a kind of James Dean quality about this.
Oh, definitely.
That like he dies at the moment when actually he ran the risk, in a sense, of being co-opted, because it's not just that he was doing it in a building that was. As I understand it, the building was to be designed with it into it.
No, it was to be designed with it into it, but then it was designed so it would disappear. So it was almost as if in both situations, they're kind of this building existed, and then Matta-Clark would be given it for maybe, I don't know, 3 months or 6 months or something to develop this work, and then the work would stay there, and then it would disappear as it was being renovated into its new use. But having said that, I think you are right, because these are two art establishments that's being co-opted into the institution of art. And these are the only two works where Matta-Clark worked explicitly with an institution as well. So yes, I mean we can make kind of lots of projections, but ultimately I think it's really important not to do that, because as soon as you start making projections, you're kind of not actually looking at the artwork, or it's something I'm not interested in doing. It's not necessarily the wrong thing to do. Yeah.
In which circles do you believe that Matta-Clark? In what circles do you believe that Matta-Clark is more influential, artistic, architectural, political?
I don't know, really. Not political, because I don't think that his artwork is kind of situated within those discourses at all. I think maybe it's impossible to say whether an artist kind of who they influence at all. I kind of want to say architectural, because I know that he's referenced a lot in architecture schools, and in fact I remember myself studying architecture in, I don't know, 1990 or something, and kind of finding out about Gordon Matta-Clark and thinking, yes, this is fantastic, I don't want to study architecture anymore. So I kind of think in a way that he's something that is referenced quite a lot, but also in kind of art as well. I think that we're in quite a different situation I think he's a lot lesser known in this country than he is in the States. I think that he has been influential, and I think it's very intriguing that there's suddenly this kind of rash of Matta-Clark stuff that's been happening, kind of since I started working on the show. So I don't know really, both.
Do you believe that his? Do you believe that his couple of years training in architecture school was really critical to his future practice, or do you think it was because his father was his father an architect?
His father trained as an architect, yeah.
So do you think like whatever, he would have probably gone into this, whether he started architecture school or not?
I don't know actually. I kind of imagine that by studying architecture, Matta-Clark became interested in space and articulation of space. And what's kind of really, really important is probably the biggest influence I imagine on his practice was when he was at Cornell in 1969, he assisted lots of artists on the Earth Art show, and that's where he met Dennis Oppenheim, Robert Smithson as well, and became interested in that whole kind of group of artists who were interested in the kind of actually making earthwork art, so that they've been kind of described as earth artists. But I think that kind of his whole practice, it's an exploration of architectural space, if not architecture. So through cutting, and also through projects like the restaurant Food, because I guess one could say that architecture is about creating spaces to be lived in, and so a restaurant is a space to be lived in and experienced in some way. But yeah, I think it is kind of crucial. And obviously he kind of knew what he was doing. I don't think you could do these cuts if you didn't know something about structure. So it must have developed his practice, yeah. Oh.
Can you maybe just briefly comment about his relationship to conceptual art? Because you sort of referred to some of that, especially with duration. But I'm just curious, how he related to other conceptual artists, other than earth artists.
Yep.
And how he might fit into that group.
Yeah. I mean, that's a kind of massive question. I could probably spend 5 hours going on about it. I guess the first thing is that if we're going to address this question is to define what conceptual art is, because conceptual art is many things. It can have a big C or a little c. It can mean absolutely anything. But I think kind of if we kind of think about conceptual art in relation to artists working in the 1970s, I think kind of a lot of artists working then, or kind of we could almost kind of look at more current artists who are returning to those ideas. So maybe if we looked at someone like Martin Creed's work, kind of the idea where it kind of nothing necessarily happens. It's about paying attention to your surrounding. It's kind of around ideas and around kind of space and time. I think for me, my own definition of what conceptual art is, and it's not necessarily the right one, there's so many of them, is that conceptual art is about engaging with time and space and ideas in some way. And that's exactly what Matta-Clark did. And I would kind of, from my kind of definition of conceptual art, I would say that Matta-Clark is one of the most important conceptual artists, because that's exactly what he was doing. So his work is not about what you see. It's about what isn't there as much as what is there. And it's about the kind of slipping between different modes of representation as well. So slipping between the different pieces. And I think that's kind of very much a kind of driving force of what could be called conceptual practice. I don't know if that really kind of vaguely answers your question, but not wholly. Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe we should probably finish. Thank you very much for coming, and also kind of I'd just like to finish off by thanking the AA for kind of being such an amazing organisation to work with, and for kind of helping so much in putting on this show. And thanks for coming too.